Hey guys, welcome to my cozy writing vlog. I'm really glad you're here. So the beta reader feedback has started rolling in for my novel Dark Witch Rising, and it's time to start looking at it and reading what they say and then figuring out what I'm going to do about it. So my beta readers fall into one of two camps. Those that read that very early, very ugly first draft, and those that hadn't, that are coming to this with fresh eyes that don't know the story at all. Now today we're going to review the beta readers who hadn't read that first draft, who are unfamiliar with the story, so their questions are more overarching and are not saying like, I like that you did this versus how I liked how you did that in another version of it. So we're looking at the ones who know nothing about the story and are just coming at it from a pure reader's perspective. So just in a recap, my novel Dark Witch Rising is a modern magic story, low fantasy. It's about witches and magic and stuff that kind of hides in the shadows of the everyday modern world. And in this case, the story is centered around rural witches in the country. And there's not a whole lot of urban fantasy going on. It's just very much set in a countryside. So there's not a lot of urban fantasy elements here. It's very much isolated, it's set in the country, there's family feud elements, there's small town politics, all that nice little stuff that you find in rural America. Now the first issue that two beta readers who had never read the story before both came across is they had a hard time differentiating between houses. Now my story is dual point of view. Part of the story takes place at a ruined house, a house that has literally exploded, and the other part of the story takes place at a different house on a different part of the country. Now, the chapter headings do have location, so like chapter 1 would be on Reese Hill, chapter 2 would be on Black River Road, but still two people came back and told me that they had a hard time differentiating between the houses. One person actually had in their head almost the entire story until they got to the very end that the two storylines were taking place at the same location but on different timelines. Like they thought the one where the house exploded was like in the future, something that had happened because of the plot line in the other point of view. Well, that's a pretty awesome idea. It's not what I was going for. So that is definitely going to have to be addressed. I don't think it's going to take much to do it. Just probably in the first couple chapters, the first chapter and then the second chapter, like the first two chapters of both points of view, I'm sorry, that sounds a little confusing, are going to need to be very cemented in their place and very clear about where they are. So the second issue I need to address is one beta reader had a question about why Henry was in chapter 1 going, like ransacking the house on Reese Hill. Like, they want to know what was his motivation for doing that. They didn't think it was very clear. So this novel has been basically piecemealed together. It has undergone so many revisions and so many drafts that this final story is taking pieces from every version of the story and putting them together. Now, part of the reason I was worried is that I was cutting a lot of exposition because I felt like it was bogging things down. But it seems like, at least in this case, I cut too much, so much that the reader no longer understood what was happening. I was too ruthless with that exposition cutting knife. So that is something that definitely needs to be addressed. But again, I don't think it's going to take a lot to address it. I think it's just going to, like a line or two, maybe in chapter 1 should suffice to explain why Henry is there, what Henry's goal is, why he's doing what he's doing. Another issue that beta readers seem to have was Maggie and Henry's relationship. Now, Maggie is the main character's mother, dead mother, but Maggie had a long-time friendship that had soured with the character Henry. Now, I allude to that in several places, but I had more than one note about this from beta readers across the board, just wanting to know more about it. And I'm kind of torn. They do have good points that sometimes this the soured relationship leads the characters to do things that you wouldn't expect. And I probably should explain why they're making some of those choices that they're making. But on the other hand, if it leads the readers at least asking questions about these characters, then I did a good job, because they want to know more about the backstory that I'm just not explaining. This story is such a limited point of view. It takes place basically over 24 hours. It's very limited. You're only seeing a very small pinhole of this universe. And I kind of like the fact that some things were left wanting about, especially about history, about backstory, things that happened 20 years ago, that there was enough breadcrumbs left that the readers picked up on it and then wanted to know more. That kind of feels like a good thing in my book. So, walkers / wraiths, apparently I'm going back and forth and calling the same creature different names. So that definitely needs to be fixed. But also, this was something that is kind of held over from previous drafts and revisions. The character Sam used to show up earlier, but you didn't know it was Sam. And then she shows up later. And this is actually a twofold issue that I found with beta readers in the second camp, the ones who had read the first draft and had clarifying questions or other questions about the story. Was Sam is a bit of a trouble spot. Sam shows up late in the story. Like, I don't think you actually meet Sam until possibly Act 3. And she just feels to them like she's thrown in there and that she doesn't really have a place in the story. But Sam's backstory with the story is that she was there much earlier in previous revisions. So I can see they absolutely have a valid point that Sam... They don't care about Sam. I haven't given them anything to care about Sam about. That was a really bad sentence, I'm sorry. But I haven't given them any reason to care about Sam, and that is absolutely valid and something I need to address. But where Sam concerns the walkers / wraiths, I think the cure to this might actually be to delete all mention of walkers. I realize they're an interesting element to some of the readers, to two of the readers, they have been a very interesting element, but they're not doing anything for the plot at this point. The only thing they're doing is expanding the world around them, but it kind of feels unnecessary at this point because it's no longer tied to the Sam story, so it's kind of hanging out there and doesn't really further anything along. So I need to cut parts of the novel because it is technically still too long, so maybe that's something that needs to be cut. Okay, so this is a big point about Chris waking up from the dead. If you're a regular follower of the videos, you know that I had a very last minute change on Chris's character. A lot of things changed on him, like literally last minute, because like I was editing it on a Thursday. I had to get it to the beta readers on Monday, and I decided to make this gigantic change. So these are valid points that they're not entirely fleshed out. But one of the issues, particularly concerning Chris waking up from the dead after he has had his throat ripped out, and it's one of Kate's first uses of magic, of like the uncontrolled instinctual magic, is that it's like, whoa, what the hell's going on? Wait, I thought Chris died, but now he's awake in this, he's alive in this chapter? Apparently, I did not make it very clear that Kate was using her magic on him and reanimating him, and it is going to have to come up in a second book, and another part of the story that I have not written yet, that the act of basically reanimating him from the dead has changed him a bit. He has physical and mental changes happening from this. But I also need to make it more clear that that's what happened, because one chapter cuts, Chris is dead lying on the ground, and she has just tried to force magic into him and nothing's happening. And then the next chapter, other characters are happening upon him, and he groans and rolls over, and he's alive, and he no longer has his throat cut open. There needs to be some kind of transition, and this is absolutely another valid point that I knew there were going to be a lot of changes needed to this last-minute Chris plot change So this does not surprise me that and I definitely need to work on that transition to make that transition very clear that she thought she failed in fixing him, but she didn't. It was just happening slower than they thought. The problem I run into this a little bit is that the novel is limited point of view. You have limited point of view from two different characters coming from, basically they're coming at the problem from two different angles. But you're only seeing it through their eyes. I don't really have that ability to, or I don't want to break at this late in the novel because this is very late, Act 3. I don't want to break and suddenly throw in this omnipotent, like, ooh, and then you saw Chris's wounds starting to close together. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to make that a late thing that is just kind of thrown out there. So I have to find some way of making one of the characters witness this, and it seems like it would be smart to make the character who stumbles upon Chris when he's alive witness like the end of that magical healing transformation. That kind of feels like the only way I can do that, but I think it might work. So back to Sam again. One of the beta readers correctly identified that Sam's a bit of a lost soul. She's kind of been wandering her whole life. She has some mental chemical imbalance issues that she's never really felt comfortable with. I'm not saying anything about the mental community, but more that how she feels about it, how she feels the comfort level she has in her own body. She's always just kind of ghosted along, no pun intended, and not really knowing where she fits in and not really know what she's going to do with her life because she just doesn't know who she is yet, I guess is the crux of the problem. And then you have the issue of her parts in part 1, Act 1 and Act 2 have been cut, so she's only showing up in Act 3. So Sam is a big, giant question mark that needs to be addressed. The reader needs to be given purpose about her, maybe be given information about her in, I don't know, earlier acts, and then be given a reason to understand why her sacrifice at the end is her finally finding some purpose for herself. I just don't know how I'm going to go about doing that. Sam and her twin brother Jack are going to take the most amount of rework. They're going to need, I don't know, more breadcrumbs, I guess, in earlier chapters. I'm going to need to weave kind of Sam's story into the earlier acts to make that final act appearance and actions more impactful. Okay, so this was pretty uncomfortable that at Act 3, I had a beta reader ask, so who's Maggie? Now, Maggie is... I thought I had done a pretty darn good job of saying that Maggie was Kat's mother, kind of in ghost form. Now, one of the things I need to address in part 2 of this with the readers who had read draft 1 and are coming at it with a second pair of eyes is that Maggie's form changed between drafts. One, it was unclear whether Maggie was a memory or actual ghost. And in this draft, I actually left both of those pieces in. I said that Kate wasn't sure if it was her memory talking or her mother's ghost talking, but I also then very blatantly say at one point that her mother's ghost said. That was definitely a bit of a my bad situation. I didn't catch the part where I said that she couldn't remember if her memory was talking or if her mother was talking, because I wanted to make it very clear that Maggie was a ghost. Because at the end of the novel, that definitely comes into play that Kate is holding on to Maggie's ghost, and the only reason Maggie's ghost is sticking around is because Kate is telling it to. Okay, so the whole sacrifice thing is an issue with both sets of beta readers. So these first-time readers were confused. They thought the actual sacrifice came from Chris and not from Maggie. And even as I'm saying this out loud, I realize, yeah, that's totally confusing. And I think the best fix to that is not to have two sacrifices, just to have one. So Chris will no longer offer himself as a sacrifice, and it'll just be Maggie doing the sacrificing. That's pretty clear cut, and I'm actually, as I'm talking about this, I'm a little embarrassed that I have something as, it feels juvenile now looking back on it, that I had two characters sacrificing themselves at the end of the, or trying to sacrifice themselves at the end of the book. And it's just too much. And it really does. It takes someone else looking at it and pointing out the really dumb stuff in your work to make you realize how dumb it actually is. So yeah, this is a hard question to answer because I don't know the answer to that myself. I know that sounds terrible coming from the author of the story. I should know where every piece is. And I used to know in previous revisions exactly what Kat's role was and where she fit in and where she was, like physically, where she was during this story. But then in this last revision, so much I had to cut and change, and where Kat used to be no longer made sense. So Kat at the moment is just an idea of, or maybe just even a memory of what her granddaughter has of her, like all the hateful things she used to say. Like that's what Kat is at this point. Now all the beta readers have had an issue with Kat, and the beta readers who this is their second time viewing the story have many valid points about her, and I'll address that in part 2. But at least for the first time readers, they just want to know where she is, what influence. It seems like to them she's still exerting influence over the story, and the best answer I can give, and I'm not sure how I'm going to work it into the story at this point, is that the influence she's exerting over the story is just from memory at this point. She does not have a physical body that she's dead for all essential purposes. Alright guys, that's the end of part 1 of this series. Stay tuned next week and we'll get out part 2, where I examine the much more in-depth questions of the beta readers who had already read draft 1 and are coming at this from a second point of view, saying that they knew where things were before and now things have changed. So if you've gotten this far, you're awesome. I love you, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.